Well, I think that the biggest maybe like view from 10,000 feet mistake is that missing out on the mindset of what's in it for the audience. I think a lot of times, especially business owners, when they're thinking of using a podcast as a marketing tool, they go into it thinking, I'm going to.
Hello, Empower Nation. Welcome to Empower Her Money podcast, where we talk all things money and business. I'm your host, Angela Duncan, and today's episode is sponsored by morewithangela.com, where we are bringing private and passive income opportunities from the wealthy to you. Keep more, make more, live more. Visit morewithangela.com today. On today's episode, I get to interview Traci DeForge. She is an international podcast expert, speaker, and she's going to teach business owners why having a podcast is so important and the biggest mistakes you might be making. Hi, Tracy. Welcome to Empower Her Money podcast. How are you today?
Hi. Great. Thank you so much for asking. And thank you so much for having me here on your show.
Yes, you are a veteran in my world, so I know that you're going to give lots of great information for the audience today, but I would love for you to first start off with your story. How did you get to what you're doing today?
Oh, thanks. Oh, wow. There's no short story about that. But what I will say is that starting Producer Podcast and running Producer Podcast for almost a decade has been a culmination of everything that I have loved, really personally and professionally. And what I mean by that is that professionally, I worked in broadcast radio for over 2 decades, and I came up through the sales and management side of that industry, ultimately was running and operating 12 radio stations in the Atlanta metro area. So pop, rock, country, we produced the University of Georgia Sports Network. And so that just gave me this amazing experience in all things from leadership, management, formatting, strategic partnerships, working with advertising and brands locally, regionally, nationally. So it was just an amazing 20 years that I spent working in an industry that I really loved. And I say personally, because I have loved radio since I was very, very small. I often share the story that I used to sleep with an AM transmitter radio under my pillow. And I used to attend when my father was the chairperson of a nonprofit organization. They would have live radio remotes, and I would always go to them. I would call into the radio stations. And so it's just been part of my DNA, the platform of audio and audio storytelling, and then ultimately business development strategy. So when I decided to start my own business and become an entrepreneur, one of the first things that I did was work with other radio stations, essentially, and then ultimately work with other entrepreneurs and helping them launch and start and run their businesses. And then that was a catalyst for me to do business development strategy for Fortune 500 companies like Weight Watchers, Microsoft, and many of those kind of high profile names. But that all my whole path led me to what it is that I do now, which is Producer Podcast as a full service production and marketing agency. But we really literally combine my two loves of really creating great quality broadcast content designed to grow businesses with that content. So the business development piece, I get to really share both of my loves, both of my passions, and integrate them together to help grow businesses.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously radio's come a long way, and, we're on a podcast platform, but, podcasts are on radio as well. So it's really transformed over the years. So seeing that, it's important for businesses to really understand the power behind radio and podcasts. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. And, I don't get asked that question often enough, to be honest with you. So when I decided to launch my first podcast, which was the true, that led to the vision of Producer Podcast. But I share this part of the story because I had really had this great idea for my first podcast. My inaugural podcast, if you will, is called Journey to There, exploring the intersection between personal and business growth, because it was a topic that was really near and dear to me, especially working with women entrepreneurs. And I knew so much about what it took to really have a broadcast quality show based on my experience in the medium. But what I also, and this is back in 2015, so that podcasting was really just starting to have awareness, and people were really starting to see the benefit of podcasting for their businesses. And being the visionary, but coming with the data to back it up, I really understood that podcasting was going to be the next iteration of radio, if you will, in a couple of different ways. One, podcasting is so much more accessible, because to aspire to have a radio show, you either have to, come from that background, know somebody, it was just like this. Radio has always just been this sort of aspirational type platform that you couldn't really access, right? And so podcasting really provides so much accessibility for people to want to share their voice. So that was really exciting to me. And then secondarily, I had so many years of seeing tangible, successful, proven track records of businesses growing as a result of using the platform of radio, either for traditional advertising methods like 30 and 60-second commercials, or having live events, or and the absolute philanthropic component that radio contributes. And so to be able to make those levels of accessibility in terms of business growth tools through podcasting is just fantastic, because it's really the perfect formula. You get to share your voice, your thought leadership, your subject matter expertise, whatever you're passionate about. And while doing that, creating an opportunity for yourself to build your revenues, grow your business, and grow your presence in other areas of content creation. So I think it's such a winning platform. And it also, one other piece of the puzzle too that's interesting is that the generation of people that are experiencing podcasting now missed out on an entire chapter of listening to radio, because it wasn't something that was popular. Maybe, they grew up with like YouTube or other ways of connecting with media, but radio sort of was something their parents listened to, right? Or their grandparents listened to. Just as a matter of fact, today I saw an article that was written by Stephen Goldstein of Amplify Media, where he's talking about now radio, the future of radio is now in the 18 to 20-year-olds, because they've been reintroduced to it through podcasting. So it's just, everything's coming full circle.
Yeah. And so you've worked with a lot of incredible podcasts. What do you think are some of the mistakes that people make when they're thinking about either launching their podcast, or if they've had a podcast? Because we don't want to waste our time. I know that I want to tell my story. I've got a voice, but what kind of mistakes do you see people making?
Well, I think that the biggest, maybe like view from 10,000 feet mistake, is that missing out on the mindset of what's in it for the audience. I think a lot of times, especially business owners, when they're thinking of using a podcast as a marketing tool, they go into it thinking, I'm going to sell my products and services. I'm going to monetize through strategic partnerships. I'm going to be able to talk about my programs and my offerings and my expertise, right? And my, me. However, podcasting is an extremely intimate medium where you have an opportunity to physically connect one-on-one. If you think about, you're listening, most people are listening through AirPods or headphones, or it's a very inclusive experience for the listener or the viewer and the host. And so you do not want to underestimate the power of that relationship in terms of building trust and building authenticity and being able to respect the time that someone's taking. It's our one resource that once it's spent, we do not get it back. So you really want to think through, like, what's in it for your audience to not only listen to you and consume your content, but secondarily, what's in it for them to like and share it and grow your audience through that. Because even though social media and posting on social media when new episodes drop is an important way to let people know about your show, the number one way for people to discover podcasts still is through people sharing and liking and telling people about your show. So I think from a mistake, that's a very esoteric mistake, if you will. If more tactical mistakes are things like just not doing your homework in terms of what are the important pieces of the foundational pieces when you launch a podcast. I think it's very important to either hire an expert, work with someone who, not somebody who's just launched one podcast and so now they're helping other people launch podcasts, because you just still don't really know if theirs was launched successfully, right? So there's so many nuances to the back end that people don't see or hear or feel that are critical to the growth of a podcast. So you really want to be able to connect with the expertise, just like you would hire somebody to build a website, just like you would hire someone to redecorate, like build a house, build a blueprint, like all of those things. Building a podcast is really not that different. You really need to know those foundational pieces.
Yeah, because ideally it's a part of your business. It's a part of your marketing, and you want to be able to track the information, the numbers, everything like that, but hiring someone who's a professional who truly knows how to help your podcast grow. And so I believe one of the things that you help your clients with is also sponsorship. So thinking about from a sponsorship, like why as a podcast host should we be thinking about sponsorships, and maybe a couple of tips on how we can either approach that or other mistakes that you've seen made in that aspect of podcasting.
Right. And, here's the thing with podcasting, that across the board, there are no true rules in podcasting, which makes it such, again, the accessibility of podcasting, whether you're the host or the audience, there are no real rules, which is a beautiful thing. The other challenge about that is there are no rules. So there are a lot of people who are trying to figure out their way in terms of what does it look like to monetize a podcast. And I think it's, as opposed to saying like what people are doing wrong, I think it's more about what myths are out there that we can bust open so that people can really look at their podcast as a separate revenue generating tool for their business. So let's say, for example, if you're just looking at, I want to start this podcast because I want to get my voice out there and I want people I want to be able to showcase my expertise. Maybe, for example, you're a therapist and you're only used to being able to scale your business by doing one-on-one sessions. And there's really no other, there's only a certain amount of hours in the day. There's only a certain amount of clients you can see during a day. So what can a podcast do? Well, you can monetize your podcast through literally expanding your reach by being able to create platforms or programs so that instead of reaching just one-on-one, your therapeutic practices, your perspectives, the things that you do inside those sessions now give you a vehicle to put that out there. And then you can then expand and do virtual sessions. So you could start incrementally by going one-on-one in person to then one-on-one virtual. That could also lead you to authoring a book, to being able to have small group communities, masterminds, or programs and products and services in that way. An underestimated monetization tool is people thinking that they have to rely on what's called dynamic ad insertion, which you may get a 30-second read from like a HelloFresh or a Mattress Plus or something like that. That's a very slow go for monetization. But if you're advertising your own products and services inside your podcast, that's like oceanfront real estate, right? So you get to use your podcast for that. And then sponsorships have a really interesting formula that a lot of people aren't talking about. And that is being able to bring vendors, relationships, people that want to be aligned with your brand, aligned with your community, into your podcast in a way that's not disruptive to the content. So those are things like having your studios be powered by a certain brand, or having the ability to integrate a special segment inside your podcast and then have someone sponsor that particular segment of the podcast. So there's more visibility there. And then you can give the sponsor more visibility in the other areas of where you promote the show. So it's just the wild, wild west in the most wonderful way, because there's no right or wrong. It's just really a right or a left. And if you have the ability to be able to have conversations with your network and people that are close to you and brands that are close to you or people that you've been doing business with for years, and just start conversations, you'd be surprised how many people want to be involved with your podcast.
Yeah. And I think I found that early on too. There's a lot of people out there. I never really thought about podcasting before I launched my own. I mean, I listened to it. So let's take it from the other side. What do you recommend to people that are going to be a guest on a podcast? Like what kind of do's and don'ts from an etiquette standpoint to, everything in between? What are your recommendations?
Well, so I have a pretty interesting perspective on this because being a full service podcast agency, when our hosts have guests, we actually send out the calendar invite to the guest with all of the information on it that they need in order to show up and be a good guest. So what I have found over the years, and it seems to be getting worse because our attention spans are getting smaller, is the very first thing that you can do as a guest is read the calendar invite. And as simple as that sounds, you would be amazed at how many people. So our podcasts typically are hosted with a live engineer in a virtual studio. So when the guest shows up, like I showed up with you today, they may not show up with a mic connected, with a headset connected. They might be calling in from their car, sitting on a park bench. Like they're not thinking that this is a recording where if you're sitting on a park bench, those bird noises, and that is a true story, by the way. I did not just make that up. We had a situation where a couple was being interviewed for a podcast that we produce, and they were sharing one cell phone on a park bench in New York, of all places. Like the sound quality, that's just virtually impossible. So that's one soapbox I have. Also, like, know about the show when you're showing up for it. I mean, there's a reason that they've asked you to be on that show. And so it's just like if you were reviewing a book, if you were doing, just learn a little bit about what scenario you're going into, why you're going into it, why did they choose you, and be able to talk to their audience. Like one of the most important things that I like to know when I'm about to guest on a podcast is, who is your audience? Like, who are you talking to? Because I want to talk to them. I don't want to just talk about me all the time. I want to be able to provide value to your audience because they show up to your show all the time. I'm only showing up to your show one time.
Yeah. And I think there's a great opportunity for business owners who don't want to launch their own podcast, but still utilize the podcast platform to, one, build relationships with that host, because you guys may be able to refer business back and forth, but two, reach an audience that you're not reaching otherwise.
Yes. And I think in that capacity, the biggest tip I would have in that regard is make sure you go into the podcast guesting opportunity with a very specific call to action. Whether you're a host or you're a guest on a podcast, at the end of the day, you really want to get value back. We've talked a lot about what's in it for the audience, but there is a component of what's in it for you in the terms of the time that you're investing and that you're spending. And so be able to go into an appearance by saying, at the end of this episode, if I'm provided the opportunity to connect with the audience afterwards, how can I do that in a very clear and concise way that's easy to remember and that's not overcomplicated? Because that's another thing that I see quite often when we do podcast audits of existing shows. Their calls to action, either they don't exist, there are multiple layers to the call to action, they're unclear, or they are confusing. And everyone is probably familiar with this phrase, but the confused mind says no. So if you're not clear and direct with what it is that you want someone to do next, they're not going to do anything. So guests need a call to action just as much as a host needs a call to action.
Yeah. And on that too, like I've had people say, go visit me at 123abcstorageunt.com. I was like, no one's ever going to remember that. That's way too long. Like figuring out what's the easiest way for you to find me and make it so simple and not complicated.
Exactly. 100%.
Yeah. So what do you see in the future? I mean, AI technology has been pretty big in helping, podcast hosts, especially kind of make our jobs a little bit easier. Never going to get rid of some of those positions. But what do you see us progressing in the podcast world?
Well, I think it's because it just we've been Producer Podcast is, coming up on 9 years of being in business. We've seen a tremendous amount of progress in the technology side of the industry, from the growth in the hosting platforms to even the virtual recording studio opportunities. So I think that the technology is going to continue to be simplified so that podcasting will be even more accessible than it already is. I think that the AI component is going to get really interesting, but where it is right now is good in a supportive capacity, but it's not good in a reliance capacity in terms of 100% relying on it without managing it, reviewing it, editing it. Like, it's a good, I like to say it's a good thought starter support tool, but it's not the end all be all tool. It's coming, that it's getting better and better, every day. But there's nothing that's going to replace the authenticity of your actual voice. Even with AI, the reason that podcasting is so powerful is that it gives people this unique opportunity to get to know the human factor of you, because you can have beautiful Instagram photos. You can have a very well-designed website. You can have AI create some fantastic structures for blogs that you may edit and enhance. But nothing is going to change the relatability that you can create through your voice and through conversations like we're having right now. Your unique perspective on an industry trends, what's happening in an industry. That's your perspective. That's not something that you can regurgitate out of a computerized chat GPT question, right? So it's going to continue to be a huge differentiator for people from a marketing capacity, in that if you want to know the real human side of somebody, you're going to want to listen and watch their podcast, because that's who they are. And AI then can help polish things up and put a pretty face on it to a degree, but it's never going to change the authenticity of what's going to come across for your audience.
Love that answer. It's a lot of great information. I agree with you too on a lot of those points. I have a fun question for you. If you could pick a superpower or a super talent, what would it be and why?
Oh my gosh. I think my superpower is my enthusiasm. I think because I'm enthusiastic about podcasting, obviously. I'm enthusiastic about entrepreneurship, obviously. But I think enthusiasm is contagious. And I think if you're enthusiastic and you see the ability for someone to grow and excel and thrive, and sometimes you can see that in other people, but you can't see that in yourself. And so if you're on the receiving end of someone who can see that in you, and that inspires you to start where you are and make a change or an implementation, or just try one thing because someone else believes in you and is enthusiastic about what's possible for you, that's a game changer. And I just feel like I really bring forth a tremendous amount of genuine enthusiasm, and that gives me the creativity to really be able to then extract possibilities. And then those possibilities become real based on being able to provide the action to take action on those possibilities. So I would say that would be it.
And we can definitely use more positive and enthusiasm in this world. So I love that. Awesome.
Thank
Tracy,
you.
if our audience wants to get in touch with you, learn more about your company, what you're doing, how do they reach you?
Oh, I'm going to give you a very simple call to action. And that is to visit our website at produceyourpodcast.com. And you'll find tons of tools and resources. You can connect with me. You can schedule a consult call. And when I say consult call, it's not a sales pitch. It's just any questions like you have right now that you've been asking me. You can basically book a call with myself, with our team, and we'll answer any questions that you need, because we are so incredibly passionate, but also just committed to really good, strong podcast growth and being able to help you grow your business. And that's why we're here. And we love what we do.
Awesome. Tracy, thank you so much for your time today.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into Empower Her Money podcast. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, share this podcast, and leave a review wherever you are tuning in.